I always believed my life was simple. I believed quiet was normal. My parents liked peace more than truth, and they taught me that family came before comfort. My mother said, "We need to talk." My father nodded. "Sit down, son." I said, "You both look serious." My mother smiled softly. "We are bringing someone to live with us." I asked who. My father said, "Her name is Lily Harper." I frowned. "Why is she coming here?" My mother said, "She has no one right now." My father added, "She needs stability." I said, "Is she family?" My mother replied, "She will be." I felt something tighten in my chest. "Will be how?" My father said, "Like a daughter to us." I laughed without humor. "You already have a son." My mother touched my arm. "That is not changing." I said, "It feels like it is." My father's voice grew firm. "Do not start with jealousy." I said, "I am asking questions." My mother said, "Questions can sound like blame." I stayed quiet. Silence was my old habit. The doorbell rang. My father stood up. "That must be her." My mother said, "Be kind." I wanted to say I always was, but the words stayed inside me. When Lily stepped in, she looked smaller than I expected. Her hands shook as she held her bag. She said, "Hello." My mother rushed to her. "Welcome, sweetheart." My father smiled. "You are safe here." Lily looked at me. "Thank you for letting me stay." I said, "You are welcome." My voice sounded polite, not warm. My mother said, "She has been through a lot." My father said, "More than anyone her age should face." Lily whispered, "I do not want to be trouble." My mother hugged her. "You are never trouble." I watched from the side. I felt like a guest in my own house. At dinner, my mother said, "Lily helped me cook." My father said, "She is very thoughtful." Lily said, "I just wanted to help." My mother smiled. "See how kind she is." I said, "That is nice." My father looked at me. "You could learn from her." I felt heat rise in my face. I helped too. My mother said, "This is not about competition." I said, "It feels like one." Lily looked down. "I am sorry if I make things awkward." My mother said, "You do not." My father said, "You belong here now." That word stayed in my head. Belong. Later that night, my mother knocked on my door. She said, "You were quiet." I said, "I am always quiet." She said, "Not like that." I asked, "Do I have to pretend this feels normal?" She said, "You have to try." I said, "I am trying." She looked at me. "Then trust us." I nodded because arguing never worked. The next morning, Lily sat at the table. She said, "I hope I do not replace anyone." I said, "You cannot replace me." She smiled nervously. "I just want peace." I said, "So do I." My father entered. "Good. Then we all agree." My mother said, "Family stays together." I looked at Lily. She looked grateful. She looked gentle. I told myself, if my parents trust her, I should too. That thought felt heavy, but I carried it anyway. I did not know then that trust could crack quietly, without sound, until one day it breaks everything. The house felt different after Lily moved in. No one said it out loud, but I felt it every day. At breakfast, my parents talked to her like she was fragile glass. My mother asked, "Did you sleep well, Lily?" Lily smiled. "Yes, thank you." My father said, "Eat more if you want." I sat there, chewing, waiting for someone to ask me anything. No one did. When I spoke, it felt like breaking a rule. "I have an early shift today," I said. My mother nodded. "Be careful." Lily looked at me. "I hope your day goes well." I said, "Thanks." Her kindness felt practiced, like something learned. That thought made me uncomfortable, so I pushed it away. Mark Wilson started coming by more often. My father said, "Your uncle worries about us." Mark laughed. "I just like this place." At first, his jokes sounded harmless. "You kids make this house lively," he said. Lily laughed softly. I forced a smile. Something in his voice lingered too long. I asked my mother, "Why is he here so much?" She said, "You notice everything." I said, "I notice because I live here." My father sighed. "Stop overthinking." That word became a wall between us. At night, I tried talking to Lily. "Are you okay here?" I asked. She paused. "Your parents are very kind." "And you?" I asked. She looked away. "I am grateful." Her answers felt finished before they started. I wanted to push, but fear stopped me. Peace mattered more than clarity, or so I believed. Days passed with polite words and heavy pauses. I began to disappear inside my own home. Silence felt safer than truth. I told myself patience would fix everything. I was walking down the hallway when I heard voices from the living room. I was not trying to listen. I stopped because my name came up. Mark said, "You know he is starting to notice." Lily replied, "He always notices too much." My chest tightened. I stayed still. Mark said, "You should be more careful." Lily said, "I am careful." He laughed. "Not careful enough." I leaned against the wall. My hands felt cold. I heard Lily say, "This was not supposed to happen like this." Mark replied, "It already did." She whispered, "What if he finds out?" Mark said, "He will not. He trusts you." That word hit me hard. Trust. I stepped into the room. "What are you talking about?" I asked. They both turned fast. Lily's face went pale. Mark smiled too quickly. Mark said, "Nothing serious." I said, "Say it again while looking at me." He shrugged. "You scare too easily." I looked at Lily. "What is he talking about?" She swallowed. "We were just discussing family stuff." I said, "My name is not family stuff." Mark raised his hands. "Relax." I said, "Do not tell me to relax in my own house." Lily said, "You are misunderstanding." I asked, "Then explain it." She opened her mouth, then closed it. Mark stepped closer. "You are imagining things." I said, "I heard enough." Lily said, "You heard pieces." I said, "Then give me the rest." She looked at the floor. That silence felt loud. Mark said, "You always had a temper." I said, "And you always talk too much." I faced Lily again. "Are you hiding something from me?" She shook her head. "No." I said, "That was fast." Mark laughed. "See, nothing there." I snapped, "Stay out of this." He raised his eyebrows. "Sensitive." I said, "Leave." My father's voice came from the stairs. "What is going on?" Mark smiled. "Just a small misunderstanding." I said, "It is not small to me." My father said, "Lower your voice." I said, "Ask them what they were talking about." Lily said, "I am tired." My mother appeared. Everyone calmed down. I said, "Calm does not fix lies." My mother frowned. "What lies?" Lily said, "I did nothing wrong." I asked, "Then why can you not look at me?" She stayed quiet. That hurt more than shouting. Mark said, "You are pushing her." I said, "You are protecting her." My father said, "Enough." I said, "Not for me." Lily whispered, "Please stop." I asked, "Stop asking questions or stop hiding answers." She said nothing. My heart felt like it was breaking slowly. My mother said, "Go to your room." I laughed. "So that is the solution." My father said, "We will talk tomorrow." I said, "Tomorrow feels too late." Mark grabbed his jacket. "I will leave." I said, "Good." As he walked past me, he said quietly, "Be careful what you assume." I replied, "Be careful what you hide." He left. The door closed. I looked at Lily one last time. "If there is truth you owe me, say it now." She whispered, "I cannot." That was the moment something inside me cracked. Not loudly, not fully, just enough to let doubt in. I went to my room and shut the door. I sat on the bed and stared at the wall. I kept hearing her silence. I kept hearing his confidence. I realized something that night. The people I trusted were standing together. I was standing alone. I waited until my parents left the house before I spoke to Mark. He was sitting at the table, calm, like nothing mattered. I said, "We need to talk." He looked up. "About what?" I said, "About what I heard." He smiled. "You are still stuck on that." I said, "Do not pretend." He leaned back. "You are reading too much into things." I said, "I heard my name." He replied, "So what?" I said, "You and Lily were hiding something." He laughed. "Hiding is a strong word." I said, "Then explain." He waved his hand. "There is nothing to explain." I felt my hands shake. "You think I am stupid?" He said, "I think you are emotional." I said, "You are my uncle." He said, "Exactly." I asked, "Does that mean nothing to you?" He shrugged. "Blood does not mean blind loyalty." That sentence stayed with me. I said, "You crossed a line." He stood up. "You are imagining lines." I said, "Tell me the truth." He looked at me, bored. "Grow up." I said, "That is all you have." He said, "Forget what you think you heard." I asked, "And Lily?" He replied, "She owes you nothing." I felt something inside me harden. "That is not your decision." He said, "It already is." I stepped back. "Get out." He smiled. "You do not own this house." I said, "Leave anyway." He picked up his coat. "You will regret pushing this." I said, "I already regret trusting you." He paused. "Careful." I answered, "I am done being careful." He left without another word. When my parents came home, I was waiting. My mother asked, "Why do you look like that?" I said, I spoke to Mark. My father said, about what? I said, about Lily. My mother stiffened. What about her? I said, something is wrong. My father sighed. Again with this. I said, please listen. My mother said, you sound obsessed. I said, I sound honest. My father said, lower your voice. I said, why does everyone protect him? My mother asked, protect who? I said, my uncle. She laughed softly. You are jealous. That word hit me harder than shouting. I said, jealous of what? She said, of attention. I said, I am asking for truth. My father said, you are creating problems. I asked, so silence is better? He replied, peace matters. I said, at what cost? My mother said, you are hurting this family. I said, I am hurting? She said, yes. I felt my chest tighten. You think I enjoy this? My father said, enough. I said, I heard them. My mother said, you heard wrong. I said, you did not even ask what I heard. She said, because I trust them. I asked, not me. She hesitated. You are emotional. That hurt more than denial. My father said, drop it. I said, or what? He said, or you will tear us apart. I laughed bitterly. I already feel torn. My mother said, you are being dramatic. I said, I am being ignored. She said, you are selfish. I asked, for wanting honesty? My father said, for refusing peace. I looked at both of them. So this is your choice. My mother said, this is for the family. I nodded slowly. I see. My father said, do not make this worse. I said, I am not making anything. My mother said, then stay quiet. I felt something break inside me. Not loudly, firmly. I said, I am alone in this house. My father said, that is not true. I replied, it feels true. No one answered. I walked to my room and closed the door. The house felt empty, even with people inside. That night, I understood something clearly. Blood does not mean loyalty. Silence does not mean peace. And family can turn away without moving at all. I packed my bag before sunrise and waited for the house to wake. My mother stood in the doorway. She said, you are really leaving. I said, I need air. My father crossed his arms. Running solves nothing. I replied, staying is breaking me. He said, you are being dramatic. I said, I am being honest. No one stopped me. Daniel Brooks opened the door when I knocked. He blinked and said, you look exhausted. I said, can I stay? He stepped aside. As long as you need. I dropped my bag. My chest finally loosened. He asked, what happened? I said, everything and nothing. He said, sit. We drank coffee in silence. Daniel said, you do not have to explain. I said, they chose silence over me. He nodded. That hurts. I said, I do not want revenge. He asked, what do you want? I said, space to think. He said, you have it. Later he said, you can take the couch. I said, I will not be trouble. He replied, you never were. That sentence stayed with me. No one had said that to me in a long time. I asked, why are you helping me? He said, because you would do the same. I wanted to believe that. Days passed. Daniel said, you wake up early now. I said, sleeping feels wasteful. He said, pain can do that. I said, I will work more. He said, work can heal. I said, or distract. He smiled. Both help. I stopped calling home. My phone stayed quiet. Daniel asked, do you miss them? I said, I miss who I thought they were. He said, that is honest. I said, honesty cost me everything. He replied, it can also give you something back. One night he said, you are calmer. I said, I learned to be quiet. He said, quiet can be strong. I said, loud never worked for me. He nodded, then build in silence. At work, my manager said, you want more hours? I said, yes. He said, you handle pressure well. I said, I learned fast. I came home tired but steady. Daniel said, you look focused. I said, I am done begging. He said, good. Sometimes I wanted to text Lily. I did not. Daniel noticed. He said, you are choosing yourself. I said, it feels wrong. He said, new things often do. I said, I thought leaving meant losing. He replied, sometimes leaving is surviving. I stood by the window one evening. Daniel asked, thinking? I said, I used to believe peace meant silence. He said, what now? I said, silence will be my choice. He said, that is power. I lay on the couch that night, and felt something rare. I felt steady. No answers came. No apologies followed. I stopped waiting. I stopped explaining. I stopped hoping someone would see my pain and fix it. I fixed what I could. I stayed quiet. I stayed moving. I stayed alive. Time moved forward without asking anyone for permission. I stayed where I was. I worked, slept, and stayed quiet. Daniel asked less questions because he saw the answers on my face. One evening, my phone rang. It was my mother. She said, "How are you?" I said, "I am fine." She said, "You sound distant." I replied, "Distance happens." She paused. "We miss you." I said, "I have not felt missed before." She said, "That is not fair." I answered, "Neither was silence." She sighed. "Things are tense here." I asked why. She said, "Lily has changed." I stayed quiet. My mother continued, "She barely talks." I said, "She was always quiet with me." My mother said, "She feels alone." I replied, "So did I." The call ended without comfort. A week later, my father called. His voice sounded older. He said, "Mark has problems." I said, "What kind?" He said, "Work issues." I replied, "That happens." He hesitated. "People talk." I said, "They always do." He said, "He is not welcome here for a while." I asked, "Why tell me?" He said, "I thought you should know." I said, "I already knew things fall apart." He went quiet. Later that night, Lily texted me. She wrote, "Can we talk?" I stared at the screen. Daniel looked over. He asked, "You okay?" I said, "She wants to talk." He said, "Do you want to?" I said, "I want peace." He said, "Then choose carefully." I replied to her. I wrote, "What do you want to say?" She answered, "I feel like I do not belong anywhere." I typed, "That feeling is familiar." She wrote, "Your parents barely look at me now." I said, "They stopped looking at me a long time ago." She wrote, "They ask questions." I replied, "Questions come late sometimes." She wrote, "I am scared." I said, "Fear grows in silence." She stopped replying. Another week passed. My father visited Daniel's place. He stood awkwardly by the door. He said, "You look stronger." I said, "I had to be." He said, "We made mistakes." I asked, "Which ones?" He said, "We ignored you." I said, "That was not the only thing." He nodded. "I know." I asked, "What changed?" He said, "The house feels empty." I replied, "It always was." He looked at the floor. "Mark is not who I thought." I said, "I tried to tell you." He said, "I did not listen." I answered, "Listening matters when it is hard." He whispered, "Your mother cries at night." I said I did too. He left without asking me to come back. Daniel asked, "How do you feel?" I said, "Clear." He said, "Not angry." I said, "Anger needs energy." He nodded. "And you are saving it." One afternoon, Lily called. Her voice shook. She said, "I lost my job." I said, "I am sorry." She said, "Mark said he would help." I stayed silent. She asked, "Are you there?" I said, "I am here." She said, "He is not answering." I replied, "People disappear when truth arrives." She cried softly. "I made mistakes." I said, "So did I." She asked, "Can we fix this?" I said, "I am fixing myself." She said, "I deserve this." I did not answer. When the call ended, Daniel said, "You did nothing." I said, "Exactly." Days later, my mother sent a message. She wrote, "We should have trusted you." I read it twice. I did not reply. I stood by the window and felt something settle inside me. I did not win. I did not fight. I did not expose anyone. Life did that on its own. I stayed still while everything else moved. For the first time, the silence worked for me. Lily called me in the evening. I almost did not answer. I answered anyway. She said, "Thank you for picking up." I said, "Speak." She swallowed. "I am sorry." I asked, "For what?" She said, "For hurting you." I replied, "That was not one moment." She said, "I know." I stayed quiet. She said, "I never meant to replace you." I said, "Intent does not erase damage." She whispered, "I was weak." I said, "So was I." She asked, "Can you forgive me?" I said, "Forgiveness is not a switch." She cried, "I hate myself." I replied, "I hated myself too." She said, "Your parents know everything now." I asked, "What does that change?" She said, "They regret it." I said, "Regret comes late." She said, "They want to talk." I said, "I will listen." The next day, I sat across from my parents. The room felt smaller. My mother said, We failed you. I said yes. My father said, we were wrong. I replied, yes. My mother cried. We chose peace over truth. I said, you chose comfort. My father said, we did not see clearly. I answered, I tried to help you see. My mother said, we thought you were jealous. I said, that hurt. She nodded. I know. My father said, Mark admitted things. I said, I am not surprised. My mother asked, can you forgive us? I took a breath. I can be honest. My father said, we deserve anger. I said, I am tired of anger. My mother said, then what do you feel? I said, distance. She flinched. Lily stood near the door. She said, I ruined everything. I said, you exposed what was already broken. She said, I love this family. I replied, love needs truth. She nodded. I was afraid. I said, fear makes choices for us. She asked, do you hate me? I said, I do not trust you. That truth felt clean. My mother said, please come home. I said, home is not a place. My father said, we want to fix this. I replied, fixing takes time. My mother asked, are we too late? I said, for some things, yes. She cried harder. Lily said, I will leave. I said, that is your choice. She looked at me. What do you want? I answered, space. She nodded slowly. My father said, we lost you. I said, you pushed me away. He whispered, I am sorry. I said, I hear you. My mother said, can we start again? I thought carefully. I will not pretend, I said. She said, that is fair. Lily said, I hope you find peace. I replied, I am working on it. She left the room. My father asked, do you feel better? I said, I feel lighter. My mother said, we will wait. I stood up. Do that. At the door, my father said, we love you. I turned. Love needs courage. He nodded. I walked out without shouting, without insults, without revenge. I protected myself. That felt like forgiveness enough that I woke up without weight on my chest for the first time in months. Daniel noticed immediately. He said, you are smiling. I said, I feel quiet inside. He asked, good quiet or empty quiet? I replied, good quiet. He nodded. That means healing. I packed my bag that morning. Daniel said, you leaving? I said, I am moving forward. He smiled. You earned that. At work, a woman handed me a file. She said, you must be new. I said, relatively. She smiled. I am Rebecca Miles. I said, nice to meet you. She said, you look focused. I replied, I learned the hard way. She laughed softly. Life teaches fast. That small exchange felt normal. Normal felt rare. Later, Daniel asked, did you talk to them again? I said no. He asked, do you want to? I answered, not right now. He said, that is allowed. I thought about my parents. I thought about Lily. I thought about Mark. I did not feel anger. I felt distance. Rebecca asked me during lunch, you always this quiet? I said, I used to be loud. She said, what changed? I replied, I listened to myself. She nodded. That matters. That night, my mother texted. She wrote, we hope you are well. I typed, I am okay. She replied, we are trying. I wrote back, keep trying. That was enough. Daniel asked, do you regret not fighting? I said no. He asked, not even a little? I said, fighting would have kept me there. He nodded. You chose freedom. I stood by the window again. The city lights looked steady. Rebecca passed by and said, you heading out? I said yes. She asked, coffee tomorrow? I smiled. Sure. That smile felt earned. I did not win by breaking anyone. I won by refusing to break. I learned that silence can be chosen. I learned that truth does not need volume. I learned that love without respect is not love. Daniel said, you look like someone who survived. I replied, I did more than that. He asked, what did you do? I said, I chose myself. The road ahead felt open. No shouting. No revenge. No fear. Just me, walking forward, whole.